Thank you to my sister for reading that condensed version of Hebrews 11 and first couple verses of Hebrews 12. Hey, at least it wasn't all the verses. I did cut some of it out to make the point. But I do want to talk about faith today. And a few questions I might ask early on is, what kind of faith does God want us to have? Where does godly faith come from? What or who is the foundation and source of our faith? And how does God treat us when our commitment to faith wavers? Those people in Hebrews 11, as she mentioned, are all shining examples or bastions of faith. But, they all had flaws too. They weren't perfect people. They all backslid at some point. You might remember she mentioned Abraham. Abraham did a lot of great things, but remember, Abraham doubted God's promise of a child with Sarah. He didn't see how that would happen. And then he went about trying to force the promise a different way by taking Hagar as his wife and having Ishmael, which created tons and tons of problems down through the years. Sarah, his wife, laughed at God. Remember that story? When he told her she'd have a baby in her old age. And Jacob, who was on the list of faith as well, he was a deceiver. He stole his brother's birthright, among other things. Moses, in anger, killed a man. And later he disobeyed God and he tried to beat water out of a rock. Not good. And the Israelites, well, they were just a sad lot overall, the whole nation. It mentioned them crossing the Red Sea, and you think something like that would give anybody enough faith to last a lifetime. But they spent much of their history in stark disobedience against God when you go back and read the stories. And Samson, we can't forget Samson, his lust for women, pagan women specifically, led to his imprisonment and death and was an embarrassment to the whole nation. And we could go through the rest of the names that she mentioned, and you could think of, yeah, they're great faith, but then what happened in the meantime? What happened after that or before that? But still, God puts him in his faith chapter in the Bible. So apparently you don't have to be perfect to be listed in the faith chapter. And billions of people, literally billions of people, have been followers of Jesus since those words were written and have read those names and those stories from the Bible. I'd like us to look together at another example of faith today, of failed faith, you might say. That's in Matthew 14. If you've got a Bible, want to turn there. Well, that's where we'll be most of the time today. What lessons can we learn from this story that we're going to go over here? Let me give you a little background and then we'll go on. Matthew 14, the beginning of the chapter and on, first John the Baptist was beheaded. Gary preached about that last week, I guess, wasn't it? We're down later in the chapter. After John was beheaded, there was a story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And we're always amazed at that story, feeding the 5,000, the other story, feeding the 4,000, how that would happen. But can you imagine if you were there as one of the disciples? And you're there by the seashore, because that's the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias, as it's called sometimes. And you've been talking to these people, Jesus is talking, and you're one of the disciples, and it's getting late, and you're thinking, what are we going to do for dinner? And what happens, of course, is Jesus finds 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he starts breaking those up and putting them in baskets. And just imagine you were there, and you come up with these baskets, and Jesus is breaking it up, and you think, how does he keep breaking up food? I mean, we only had 5 loaves and 2 fishes to start with. But he keeps reaching somewhere and pulling a loaf out and reaching somewhere and pulling a fish out. And people start passing out the baskets, and he's still up there pulling food out, putting in more baskets. And then they start passing the baskets up around through the people. And you're the disciple, and you're passing the basket, and you let go of it, and it goes through this group of people and comes back to you. And you look in there and go, got a lot of fish and bread still in there. So you pass it to another dozens of people, and comes back to you again. You're like, still got a lot of bread and fish in there. So you do that for who knows how long, till 5,000 people are fed. and you take up the leftovers. That was got to be kind of a faith high, wouldn't you think? I mean, don't you imagine their faith was pretty pumped about that point in time to see something like that happen. In fact, the people were so impressed. In the same story in John 6, there's 3 parallel accounts of the same story. It doesn't mention this except in John 6. It said the people acknowledged Jesus as the prophet. That could be with a capital T-H-E, the prophet. Go back to Deuteronomy 18:15, where Moses said, I will send another one like me, a great prophet. You should listen to him. What Moses predicted would happen. And so the people who had just eaten all this bread and fish, they're thinking, that is that prophet. He's the guy. So the disciples are like, oh yeah, we're with him. So they're all pumped and they're excited and everything's great and wonderful. And it says that the people were about to take Jesus by force and make him king. Well, it wasn't time for that yet. And so he sent the disciples out in a boat to go across the lake, and he went up, it says, to a high place to pray. So let's pick up the story there. I've got a song I'd like to play. Well, have Lee play. And it's just off a CD. It's not a video. And I could have got it on a video, but I thought that would be a little distracting. So if you'll just listen to the song as he plays it, then I want you to pay attention to the words, and especially the way the song ends. And then I'll be right back.
Beside myself in a boat small and light, pushed off for the messers in the first watch of the night. But a storm came out of the night, blowing hard down on the prow. We started boozing headway, shipping water, stern and bow. When someone shouted loud, hey, look, to start on the sea. The men screamed out in terror, and before we all could see, someone was walking on the water. And we trembled, cried, and prayed. He stopped and turned and spoke to us. Is I free? I shouted out, Jesus, if you would call to me, and tell me now to come to you and walk across the sea. And without a second's thought, he looked at me and answered, come. Laying his eyes to the water, my mind went blank and numb. I climbed across the meadow, looking straight into his eyes. But long before I reached his side, the wind began to rise. And I forgot in an instant, and I sank just like a stone. I cried out, Jesus, save me. His hands on my own. Faith, he said, what made me doubt my word? Have you been this long with me without knowing what you heard? We climbed into the boat, and all at once the wind was gone. The sea turned calm and gentle, the day began to dawn. We knelt amazed and worshipped him for the power he displayed. All that we had seen had left us wondering and dismayed. It was not till after Pentecost I began to understand. When I doubted him, he did not let go my hand.
You can just leave that picture there if you want to, Lee. So that's Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33, basically. Let's go back in that story a little bit. I love that song, by the way. That's Don and windy Francisco, Don Francisco, sings and plays guitar, and his wife plays guitar. So, what about that? Jesus sent his disciples to the other side of the lake, and he stayed to pray. The wind and the waves came up. The song says about midnight. We don't know exactly what time the wind and waves came up, but they got pretty bad. The disciples were worried about losing their life. It was that bad. Why? What do you think they were thinking on the boat back then? Think of the time frame, the history, where they were placed in history, where they were located geographically. Israel was a nation surrounded by pagan nations. The Romans were ruling their country. The Greeks had a big influence. And if you remember anything from Greek and Roman mythology back in high school, remember there are all kinds of gods and goddesses for everything. Goddesses of the deep and the sea and the ocean, and there was all kinds of bad stuff going on because the gods mainly toyed with people and tortured people and created problems for human beings. The mythology is the gods were the ones who were petulant and petty and problematic, and the humans had to put up with it. And a lot of times the gods would get angry, and they had their little minions that they would send around to do things to bother people. And so they're out in the middle of this sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. It's nighttime, so it's dark. It's been dark for hours. Jesus, their leader, is over yonder somewhere. He's not with them. They're out there by themselves in the middle of the sea, and this big storm comes up. Waves are rolling, the wind's blowing, it says. And it's got to be scary. The lake, I looked it up, is 141 feet deep in the center. They're apparently out probably near the center of the thing because they can't go back to that shore, and they're not making it to that shore because of the wind and waves. And they're fishermen, some of them, and so you think, well, they're used to being on the lake. But I'm guessing if a storm blows up, they don't want to be in the middle of the lake. I've done that before. That's kind of scary. So if they know it's 141 feet deep, they just know it's really, really deep. You might say, well, they're fishermen. They're used to fishing. Well, yeah, but when you fish, you only fish the first top few feet relatively. You're not fishing 140 feet down. They didn't know what was down there. They didn't know what was in the bottom of that lake. It's cold and it's dark. And if they fell out of the boat, it's a long way down there, and it's pretty hard to breathe once you get your head below water. So they were not excited about what was going on. They were worried if the gods. Now they were Jews and they weren't supposed to believe in other gods, but again, the Romans were there and they had their religion and their temples, and I'm sure that all that was affected. And they heard these things and they heard the stories, and whether they believed it fully or not, it would create enough doubt in their mind that they didn't want to fall out of that boat. They didn't want that boat capsizing with them out in the dark in the middle of a giant sea. I remember once, I don't know if you've ever been caught in a storm, but one time years ago, our church had a youth camp, and it was up in Minnesota, far northern Minnesota. It's beautiful up there. And we would take these trips to what's called the boundary waters between the U.S. and Canada. And there's a lot of water up there, a lot of big bodies of water up there. And we would go out in these Voyager canoes. They're big canoes, 6, 8 people would get in there and paddle. And that's what you would take up through the boundary waters for several days. Camp out at night and so forth. Get eaten alive by mosquitoes and black flies and no-see-ums, and it was really comfortable. But we would, some storms would blow up sometimes, and those are big enough bodies of water, kind of like the Sea of Galilee. We'd usually go around the shore and up to the inlets, and you'd get to the next lake, and then you'd find your way around and go to the next body of water. But there was sometimes, especially if you were running kind of late in the day and you needed to get to your campsite for the night, we'd say, well, let's just cut across the lake. It's quicker than following the shoreline. And one time we cut across the lake. It was quicker, all right, till the wind and the waves started coming up. And then we were like, I don't think this was the greatest idea we ever had. And we're paddling, and we're 6 or 8. I can't remember. I think there were 6 of us in the canoe at that time. And we're paddling for all we're worth. So we can see the shore over there, but we're not making much headway. And we're just hoping that we can make it there before either we get wore out or the boat capsizes, one or the other. So I was a little scared about drowning, and was pretty tired by the time we hit the shore. So wonder what the disciples felt like. It came on, it says later, it says it came to be the fourth watch of the night. The fourth watch would have been from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So however long before that they had been rowing, paddling, bailing, whatever it is they were trying to do to get to the other side of the lake. And then you look out, and besides worry about the monsters that are below you and everything, sea creatures, who knows what's down there, what kind of tentacles might grab you. Then you look out and you see something walking across the water. It's moving towards your boat. Well, you know there's nothing supposed to be on top of the water moving towards your boat, and so now you're more scared than you were before. And you see this figure coming at you. And it's interesting, one of the stories in Mark 6, a parallel story, not in Matthew, but it says Jesus saw the disciples were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Jesus saw, and I think, well, how in the world did he see them? It's dark, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I wonder if that meant Jesus knew a lot of things, and it seems like he could see into people's hearts and circumstances in ways that we couldn't. Somehow he had a pretty indication of what was going on out there on the ocean. Sometimes we say that same thing, well, I could see such and such happening. And we might not physically with our eyes see it, but we see it, we know it, we're running it through our head. And so I suspect with the wind, with the waves, with the darkness, knowing the disciples, how far they would have made it by such and such a time, he had a pretty good idea what they were up against. And so he walked out to meet them. He didn't tell them he was going to walk out to meet them. They weren't expecting him to walk out and meet them. And they probably at night, it's not like he had a spotlight on him. They were wondering, what is that? They're looking out. And here comes something at them out of the dark. Jesus, it says in the story, against their worked up fears, their overwrought imagination, their fear of this apparition, whatever it might be, he speaks up. And he says a phrase that he says a lot of times through the Bible. It is I. Don't be afraid. You can go back to the Old Testament, the earliest chapters, and follow it through. Fear not. Don't be afraid. I'll never leave you or forsake you. I'm here. How many times did Jesus, even in the Old Testament, God, say that to, whether it's individuals such as Moses or Abraham, the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, the fire by night, the cloud by day? He's always there for us, and he has to remind us sometimes. It is I. Don't be afraid. So they hear that voice. Do they know it's Jesus at that point? Is he close enough they can really tell? Do they recognize the tenor of his voice? I don't know. But apparently the fear diminished. It didn't diminish, and I thought about this. Why would he say that? Why would he expect that to diminish the fear? Why would he expect that would help their faith to know that he was there? When you think of those times in the Bible where God said, I'm here, he didn't give them stronger walls at that point. He didn't give them a bigger army. In fact, sometimes he shrunk their army down on purpose and said, I'm here, and we're going to work this out. He didn't give them more political power. They were subjugated to Rome at this point. They weren't on top of anything on their own, but somehow he thought that just by saying, it is I, don't be afraid, that would help them. And it did, really, when they thought about it, because the presence of God was there. They recognized, hopefully, I'm sure they did, the presence of God. They might have wished for a bigger boat, they might have wished for a lot of things, but when he said it is I, they went, oh, okay, that's good. Lord, it says, if it really is you, and the Bible a lot of times uses the word if, and the word since, S-I-N-C-E, would fit in just as well. We do the same thing the way we talk English sometimes. We'll say if, and we mean since. And so you might read that, Lord, since it is you, bid me to walk on the water. Peter knew that Jesus could do anything. And Peter, I think, knew, after being 3 years with Jesus, that he could do anything through Jesus, with Jesus in him. Peter's faith at that point was looking at Jesus. For him to speak to him, he had to be looking at him. The song made that pretty clear as well. Peter, in a sense, forgot about the storm around him. He forgot about the wind and the waves. Not that they weren't still there, but he was looking at Jesus. And that calmed things. That settled his mind. That was his source of faith, wasn't it? It wasn't, oh, I feel better now because I have more power, I have a bigger boat, or something's changed about my surroundings. Things have gotten better in my life. No, the difference was he went from looking at all the troubles around him to looking at Jesus and going, he's who I need to focus on. He's the guy with the power. He's the one that can take care of this situation. That's the foundation and the source of my faith, is that man right there walking across the water. He was looking at Jesus. Peter, I don't think for a minute felt like his faith would help him walk on water. I don't think he sat there in the boat and he analyzed, well, how much faith do I have today? Let's see, yesterday I had this much, and now I added a little bit. We did the bread thing and the fish, and so that helps. So I'm kind of up to this. Yeah, I think I can get out of the boat. I think that's enough. Did we ever kind of cogitate and calculate things that way in our faith walk sometimes? Like, well, I've done this, or things are kind of on a high, and yeah, I think I can handle this situation kind of by myself because I've got enough faith to do that. We hear about that sometimes from preachers. Build your faith. Religion, I should say, tries to get us to have more confidence in ourselves sometimes, to find our inner strength, they might talk about, to build up our own personal faith and our abilities, to try to get us to be real confident in what we can do, because we're experienced Christians now. We've got decades behind us. We've built our faith. We've strengthened our faith. It's like building a muscle. You ever heard that? Faith is like building a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. I think that's wrong on many levels. There might be a point there of a little analogy that might have some validity, but I think that's not a good, healthy way to say that. Our faith is in Jesus Christ. In fact, I wonder if it's even our faith sometimes, or if it's his faith that he puts in us. We can have all kinds of experiences in life, some that will, quote, build our faith, some that seem to tear down our faith. If we're just accumulating and adding up and building something within ourselves, that's so up and down and wishy-washy that I'm not sure that's a very good foundation. In fact, I know it's not. Peter was looking at Jesus, and he knew that was what was going to get him out on the water, not something he had worked up and added up amongst himself, within himself. So he stepped out of the boat, looking at Jesus. And guess what? He walked on the water. I don't even know if he was thinking about that he was walking on the water. He just saw Jesus, and he said, I'm going to that guy. And he got out and he headed to Jesus. And all the stuff was still going on, and he's walking on the water. For a while. You know what happens next, right? Yeah. It says Peter looked around. Let's see if I can find that. It says, and he came toward Jesus. Verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind was always there, but now he focused on the wind. He saw the wind. He was afraid, and he began to sink. Well, I don't know about you, but isn't that the way life is? We look to Jesus, we're good. We start looking around sometimes at other things, other people, other examples, looking inside at ourselves. I don't think I'm strong enough for this. Probably because we're not. Because we need to look to Jesus. And Peter demonstrated that because he began to look around and he began to sink. And it wasn't a pretty sight. Didn't Jesus just say to his eye, don't be afraid, not too far back. But Peter's faith, even after 3 years of being with Jesus, wasn't sufficient. It wasn't strong enough to hold him on top of the water. He didn't have enough brownie points added up to be able to walk on water. He needed Jesus to be the source of his faith. No matter how much he exercised his faith, it didn't keep him on top of the water. Maybe he thought, well, I've got this much faith, and I can count on Jesus for a little more faith, and between the two of us, we'll have enough faith. kind of like a hybrid car. Any of you ever ridden in a hybrid car or own a hybrid car? It's got the electric engine and the gasoline engine. I don't know exactly how they all work. I've been in one a couple of times. They're pretty amazing because they run on the electric engine most of the time. Got the batteries piled somewhere in the car. I've never looked. But when you need extra oomph sometimes or recharge the batteries, the gasoline kicks in and it keeps going and keeps you moving all the time. But it takes both the electric and so we might think maybe God's kind of like that, like he counts on us to have all the strength and faith that we can build up. And if it's a little bit short, he'll step in and kind of fill in the gap. No, I think he wants us to look to him for that. That's what I'm thinking he wants us to do. He says, look, I'm the source of this. I'm the one walking on the water. I'm the one. You just keep your eyes on me, and that's where your strength, that's where your faith comes from. Jesus is going, I'm not the auxiliary power. I'm not the little extra boost that you need. I'm the source. I'm the key. I need to be at the center of your faith. We might have a lot of things that try our faith. Crises in life that come along, economic disasters, health problems, bad health problems. Someone dies that we weren't expecting to die. We hear these things in our prayer request every week. Family breakups, relationships that fracture and that hurt. Those are big things that happen that we count on our faith to carry us through, but doesn't it take faith, too, to avoid just gossiping about people? Doesn't it take faith just to keep our mind clear of smut that's all around us in the world today? Don't we need to have faith to love the unlovable, to forgive the ones that hurt us? Is that something that you and I can just build up within ourselves, or do we need to keep our eyes on Jesus? To count on him while we're trying to become a new creation, that it's through his faith in his Father, shared with us through the Holy Spirit, that carries us through. Our own faith will not carry us over the waves and the wind. We need to rely on Jesus. But Peter knew that quickly. He turned away from Jesus for a minute and he began to look around. But then as he began to sink, as it's shown here in the picture right there behind me, he did cry out, Lord, save me, because he realized now he wasn't walking on the water. It wasn't him doing it. It was Jesus doing it. And once he got his faith focused on something else other than Jesus, he began to sink. And you and I can do that spiritually as well. We lose our focus on Jesus as the source of all our strength and even our faith, we can sink. But when we do, we need to cry out, Lord, save me, just like Peter did, because he realized where the saving faith came from, and it came from Jesus. Verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. What state was Peter in right then? Well, he doubted. He'd let things distract him. He'd gotten his focus off of Jesus. For that period of time there when he was beginning to sink, he was not in a good place mentally. He had let things distract him. Do you and I ever do that? Do we ever find ourselves distracted, not doing what we want to do? Maybe find ourselves repeating some bad habit that we told ourselves we wouldn't do again, caught in some sin that we are struggle with. Peter was demonstrating that as well. He was in a doubtful, weak spot right there. So what did Jesus do? Again, religion will sometimes tell us that, well, you need to get your act together. You're away from God. You've separated yourself from him. He's not interested in you right now because you're sinning. You're in a bad place. But is that what we see here with Peter? Here's Peter in this moment of weakness. He just cries out to Jesus in an instant. And Jesus doesn't go, well, I need you to build your faith up a little stronger. I need you to learn to tread water somewhat. I wonder if you can learn the backstroke. There's some life-saving techniques you could use out here. But no, he reaches out immediately and grabs him. Pulls him right up. He does that with you and me. We're struggling. We may be in a weak spot. He doesn't turn away and say, well, kind of embarrassed for you. If you can get it together a little better, I'll come to you. No, he's that close that at just the minute we call out, he, boom, grabs our hands, and there he is. See, in Romans 5, it says this. Verse 6, it says, you see, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And later it says that even when we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He doesn't say, when you get it all together, God will swing back around and check on you and see if he's interested. It says, while you're still powerless, while you're still under the sway of whatever it is, while you're still doubting, while you're still looking at the wind or the waves, sometimes in life, or just not knowing, not trusting that God's really got things under control. But he says, I'm always there. It is I, be not afraid. And he reaches out and he said, even when you're powerless, even when you're in doubt, I'm right there for you. He died for us, and he reaches out to share his life with us in our weaknesses. He saved Peter in the midst of his weakness, of his doubt, and his confusion. He didn't wait for Peter to exercise his faith, to somehow get more muscle built up. He just reached out and grabbed him. He goes on in the rest of that verse. He says, you have little faith, why did you doubt? You have little faith, why did you doubt? Peter needed faith. We all need faith. I'm not saying don't have faith, but our faith needs to point us to Jesus and what he can do, not be some kind of a workout routine, muscle building routine, to where it's focused on us, and we finally build ourselves up to the point that now we have saving faith, or now we have faith that will help us get through the next crisis. Our faith needs to be to turn and look at that man that walks on the water and admit, look, my faith isn't strong enough to save me. My faith is to get me to look at you, and you save me. You're here in the midst of this trial. You're here while I'm here in the hospital with this person. You're here while my finances are going to pieces. You're here in whatever may be going on, Jesus. And I trust you to be here. And I can't save myself, but you can. We trust in the promises that he made. I looked in a couple Bible commentaries. I've got a couple of actual real Bible commentaries that are printed. Now, nobody does that anymore. They all go off the internet and look. But I pulled off a couple of Bible commentaries and off the shelf, and they're very, very thick. Very, very smart people. And one of them, well, both of them actually said basically the same thing. It says, Jesus reproached Peter for his puny faith and for giving way to doubt. I don't know that I take that as a reproach. I think Jesus was just pointing out the reality of what had just occurred to help Peter see what had happened. I don't think, God knows who we are. He doesn't have to reproach us. I tell people, God knows we're dirt. I mean, that's where we came from, and that's where we're going back. Now, in between there, we're made in the image of God, and that's wonderful. So he has special thoughts about us, obviously. But to reproach Peter because Peter looked around and began to sink, I think God was just saying, look here. You have little faith, not like you need more. No, you need just enough faith to look at me. Look over here. That's all he was telling Peter, I think. And it was a lesson to all the rest of them as well. It was never about the size or the strength of Peter's faith. It was about the focus point of Peter's faith, which should be on Jesus. And I noticed one thing here too. If he was going to reproach Peter, what about the other 11 guys? They didn't get out of the boat. You ever think about that? Peter's the one that got out of the boat. He had some kind of faith, right? If we're going to measure faith, Peter had something. He looked at Jesus and he said, if it's you, Lord, bid me to come to you. And he got out of the boat. That's a get out of the boat kind of faith. That's why I titled the sermon that. Because Peter at least had something that let him look to Jesus and get out of the boat. The rest of them were hanging on the gunnels and the side rails as the boat was rocking. They're like, I'm not going out there. I'm staying in here. I feel safer in here. And if someone was going to get reproached, I guess in good humor, it would be probably Jesus looking over at the other 11 guys and go, yeah, what about you guys? And they're just hanging in there. So Peter's not the one to pick on in this story. I think if we're going to pick on somebody, let's look at the other 11 and kind of good humoredly go, yeah, well, yeah, look at you guys. Lots of stories in the Bible where, Jesus points people's faith to himself. He doesn't tell them to go out and build up a bunch of faith. He just says, look at me. And over time and over experience, we see that he steps in, that he's there. And in that sense, our faith is built. But our faith isn't built in what we can do. Our faith then becomes built on what he has done and what he can continue to do. And I think that's what he wants us to look at. So what does Jesus expect of us? He expects us to look at him as he walks with us all the days of our life, including the really rough and the really stormy times, but also just every day, just those little moments, just those little thoughts, those little instances where we need the help, where we need some support, where we need the security, where we need to know that somebody outside of ourselves, bigger than ourselves, someone who can actually handle the situation is there. So he wants us to look at him. He wants us to listen to his voice when he says, it is I. Don't be afraid. He means that. Don't be afraid. He wants us to trust in his promises because he's given us lots and lots of promises of what he'll do. He won't remove every trial. He won't keep every pain from coming to us or the people that we love around us. But he gives us promises along the way, and the main one is, I'll be with you through everything. You can count on that. And he wants us to rely on his faith, on the faith that he has in his Father, the faith that he tells us that he shares with us through his Holy Spirit. I think that's what he wants out of us. And he wants us to step out of the boat. Sometimes we're pretty comfortable where we are. We think we feel safe, but things around us are rocky. And he wants us to sometimes just go, well, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm going to have to just step out of the boat, go on faith in Jesus, that this can work out. Peter stepped out of the boat, and that's the kind of faith that he had. He risked the unknown, and sometimes you and I have to risk the unknown. Even though we're very, very comfortable sometimes is where we are, sometimes we have to step out and go a different direction. And realize that his faith, the source of all our faith, is sufficient. And he will give it to us. The chorus of the song that Cheryl had us singing, the Lean on Me song. She picks these for reasons, right? Lean on me when you have no strength to stand. When you feel you're going under, hold tighter to my hand. Lean on me when your heart begins to bleed, when you come to the place that I'm all you have, then you'll find I'm all you need. That's what the song says. So following the example of all the faithful heroes of Hebrews 11 that my sister read about, we are encouraged, it says in Hebrews 12, as she read, to let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. In the small things and the big things, let's ask God for out of the boat faith, and then let's step out with our focus in faith on the faith of Jesus.